Mabuhay! Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast with me, Christine. Every 2 weeks, I bring you stories of infamous crimes committed in the Philippines, the country of my mother and where I grew up for most of my life. Before I start today's episode, I would kindly like to ask you to follow us on Instagram at Lagim Podcast. There you will find links to our resources for each episode. Lagim is also on Twitter at LagimPod and on Facebook. Just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. I have also set up a TikTok account for Lagim, and you can find us at Lagim Podcast on TikTok. Now, I don't know in which direction I want to take this TikTok account because I am not quite sure how to promote a podcast on TikTok. I have a TikTok account for other things that I do, but I need to really plan how to make content on TikTok. At the moment, I'm putting on some funny-ish type of content on there. And as a bonus, if you want to follow us, and maybe you should follow us, you can see my face. So I guess that's one reason to go there. Make sure to follow us on TikTok at Lagim Podcast. I have also been getting a few lovely feedback and requests from listeners about putting the episodes on YouTube. And do not worry, that's definitely on my to-do list. I am just completely overwhelmed with my day job and with writing all the content. I also have a fashion Instagram page and TikTok page that I manage that I'm really passionate about as well. So it's just a lot at the moment, but I will definitely make sure that a YouTube channel will be started in the new year, and I will let you know about it on Instagram. So watch this space. And before I forget, please do not forget to rate Lagim on Apple Podcasts to help give this little passion project of mine a boost. Now to our story. Content warning. This episode contains details of rape, murder, assault, and torture. So please make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening to this episode. By now, you may have noticed that of the 3 episodes that I've published so far, 2 of them are from the 90s. I think I've subconsciously chosen these ones as these were the most famous ones during my formative years when I lived in the Philippines. These were the cases that I would see and hear about on the evening news before or after dinner, and what I would hear adults talk about in the family for weeks on end. So it would come to no surprise that I will be again talking about a 90s case. Today we will be talking about the Eileen, Sarmenta, and Allan Gomez story. Now, full disclosure, I've known this case for the longest time as the Mayor Sanchez case for reasons that will become apparent later. Again, this just shows how the victim or victims get erased so easily in the narrative in favor of the slightly more prominent perpetrator. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Eileen Sarmenta was a 21-year-old young woman on a scholarship at the University of Philippines, Los Baños, or UPLB. UPLB is a sister campus to the University of Philippines in Diliman, Quezon City. Whilst the latter offers the more classical courses such as law, engineering, literature, and politics, UPLB, or colloquially known amongst its students as LB, focuses on agricultural courses. And this made sense for Eileen, who had a passion for agriculture. She was a 4th-year student and looking forward to her graduation. She majored in food and nutrition for large animals. Allan Gomez was a friend of hers, and they knew each other through the university's agriculture program. There were rumors that they may have been lovers, but they both maintained that they were mere friends. After all, Eileen very much had a boyfriend back in 1993, and this boyfriend would later give a much-needed start to the timeline of what had happened to both Eileen and Allan. So, what do we know? According to Eileen's boyfriend, Cesar Ong, he and Eileen said goodbye to each other around 9:15 p.m. after spending some time together on the 28th of June 1993. Eileen told Ong that she will be meeting her friend Gina before heading home. Ong, who was a bit worried about her, asked her to not go out anymore, but Eileen insisted and reassured him that everything will be just fine. After parting and on her way to meet Gina, Eileen bumped into her friend Allan Gomez. Allan owned a car, a van specifically, and naturally offered Eileen a ride to meet her best friend Gina, who was already waiting at Tap's restaurant, a popular hangout place for students back in the day. After picking up Gina, the three of them drove to a store nearby where all three were seen by a fraternity brother of Allan's. This frat brother said that he saw all three of them around 10 or 10:30 in the evening. The group then bought 2 bottles of beer and were thought to head back to their campus in Allan's van. It would seem that this was the last time both Eileen and Allan were seen alive. Now, usually at this point, I would tell you how both Eileen and Allan's bodies were found because it makes complete sense to tell the story like this and proceed with what would be the police investigation and then a court trial. However, the circumstances surrounding how Eileen and Allan's bodies were found are intrinsically linked to the people who were later on deemed as responsible for their deaths. So, let me skip that part for now and continue with the story. I promise it will all make sense later on. This much I can say. Allan's body was found in Barangay Imok the next day on the 29th of June 1993, whilst Eileen's body was found some 6 kilometers away in Barangay Mabacan, Calauan, Laguna. Following the discovery of their bodies, someone had then made a call to Eileen's mother. She was urged to come down to Mabacan immediately. Eileen's parents drove down to where the residents said their daughter was found and were then told that their daughter had been killed and left at the back of a vehicle. From what I could piece together of the story, it does not look like Eileen's parents saw their late daughter's body when they arrived in Mabacan. Nevertheless, this must have been the most devastating thing to hear for them. It is not clear whether the parents were then told to maybe go to the police or elsewhere to ascertain where exactly the body of their late daughter was. For reasons that will become apparent later, it would seem that they would have been urged to get in touch with the police to learn about their daughter's fate and how to subsequently proceed. Enter Police Inspector Rizaldi Garcia. Police Inspector Rizaldi Garcia became the chief investigator in the Sarmenta Gomez case. He was not part of the local police force, but was a special investigator from a separate group called the CIDG, or Criminal Investigation and Detection Group. He first noticed that the first responders to the bodies hardly collected any evidence, something that struck him as odd since they were clearly dealing with a heinous murder, or murders in this case. It also quickly dawned on Garcia that he was very much lacking a witness. No one had come forward to provide any intelligence and information at all. And so Garcia was grasping at straws, trying to put together a timeline of both Eileen and Allan's last whereabouts. Garcia was also at a disadvantage as he was not able to see both Eileen and Allan's bodies right away. He was only able to see their bodies when they arrived in a Tamarao van after it was driven to the police station. He would say later in an interview that even before knowing what he later found out about the case, he had a strong instinct that neither Allan nor Eileen were killed where they were found. He just could not prove it then. He had a nagging feeling as well that something was indeed fishy. He felt like he was witnessing a cover-up because the Calauan police force collectively did not seem to bother about the killings. At the beginning, he had requested to be driven to the crime scene, but no one from the local police force wanted to escort him. Another thing that raised suspicion, of course. Eventually, he found someone to escort him to the crime scene, as in the locations where Eileen and Allan's bodies were found. The colleague's name was Aurelio Centeno. Centeno also happened to be one of the first responders to the locations where Eileen and Allan were found. Please remember this detail for later on. Now, before heading on to the crime scene, Garcia wanted to ascertain if there were any reports written about the bodies that were found. To his surprise, but not to mine, no report whatsoever was filed or was in the process of being filed 24 hours after the discovery of the bodies. This again was highly unorthodox. So Garcia proceeded with what he had to do with what little he had. After all, he was sent to investigate and not speculate about cover-ups or conspiracies. However, Garcia was alarmed yet again when he learned that Centeno disappeared from Calauan a few days into Garcia's investigation. How is it that the only person who was willing to assist him in some way with this investigation had now disappeared, and where was he? Garcia, being the multitasking investigator that he was, made sure that someone was also investigating Centeno's disappearance. Garcia had a hunch. Local police forces in Manila reported to CIDG that Centeno was seen working as a mover of sorts and that the local police had made contact with him. Centeno told them that he had become worried about the situation in Calauan. There were rumors that he was involved in the killings of Eileen and Allan, and he did not want to be arrested. Garcia instructed the local police force in Manila to convince Centeno to talk to him and tell him why he was feeling scared about going back to Calauan and whether the rumors had any legs at all. Centeno eventually agreed. He finally wanted to talk. The following account of what had happened to Eileen and Allan is mostly made up of Centeno's testimony. Any parts that are not being told from Centeno's perspective are part of the agreed statement of facts that would later be presented in court during the trial in 1995. According to Centeno, then Deputy Chief of the Philippine National Police in Calauan, George Medialdea, and a member of the security detail of then Calauan Mayor Antonio Sanchez, Vicencio Malabanan, fetched him on the morning of June 28, 1993, in an ambulance owned by the municipality of Calauan. Malabanan would later turn state witness and corroborate everything that Centeno would testify about. Malabanan and Centeno were told that the purpose of the day's journey was to apprehend a notorious drug dealer and gun runner called Rodolfo Calva, aka Tisoy. The group, however, proceeded to pick up a few more people to add to their party, including Zoilo Ama and Luis Corcolon. All men were picked up at different barangays or little towns around Calauan, and so it took some time to round them all up. They made a few stops at Barangay Imok and Wawa. It seemed from Centeno's testimony that the group essentially used up the whole day to drive around different little towns around Calauan to look for this drug dealer, only to head back to Calauan Center around 7 p.m. in what then turned into a fruitless search operation. Being back in Calauan, the group stopped at a Shell filling station. They picked up a relative of Luis Corcolon called Rogelio Corcolon and two other men called Pepito Kawit and Baldwin Brion. The group was then told by Luis Corcolon that they were actually headed to Los Baños and they will not be continuing anything related to Tisoy Calva. The real reason they were all rounded up and now driving to Los Baños was to look for a girl that was the object of the mayor's desire. Luis Corcolon explained that the girl will be taken to the mayor as a gift. It is a horrifying thought, and I cannot imagine the kind of thought process that preceded such a diabolical plan to ruin someone's life, just to please someone else. Centeno testified that upon arriving at UP Los Baños, Centeno had to drive around campus at a snail's pace in order to allow Luis Corcolon to carefully scour the location for this girl. The search was not successful, so Centeno was ordered by Luis to exit the campus and drive to a commercial building called Agrix Complex. Upon arriving at Agrix Complex, the men alighted from the ambulance. Centeno overheard Luis informing his quote-unquote boss over the walkie radio that they were in the area. Centeno testified and confirmed that the boss was indeed Mayor Antonio Sanchez. Centeno said that the group entered the complex and observed a Tamarao van parked in front of a cafe. The van was Allan's. Both Eileen and Allan were still in the van when both Corcolon men approached them. The men were armed. Centeno testified that the men yanked both students out of the passenger and driver's seats and forcibly pushed them into the back of the van. Centeno remembered that Eileen was wearing a t-shirt, a pair of white shorts, and trainers. After both Eileen and Allan were forced to the back of the van, the men boarded the van save for Centeno and Malabanan. They were told to follow the van in the ambulance, convoy style. The van then hastily drove to Erai's farm, a farm owned by Mayor Sanchez. Centeno remembered that as soon as the van arrived at Erai's, the two students were yanked out of the van. Eileen was gagged with a handkerchief, and her hands were tied together at the back, and so were Allan's. A white towel was then tied around Allan's mouth. A few moments later, Mayor Sanchez appeared and came out in a tracksuit and asked the men, "My children, what is the problem?" Luis Corcolon apparently responded, "Mayor, this is the girl you have been longing for. She is our gift to you." The mayor responded, "She's really beautiful, but who is this man?" pointing at Allan. Medialdea responded that Allan was with Eileen when they took her, and he was taken along with her to avoid complications. Both students were then brought inside the mayor's house, where the mayor forcefully took Eileen into his own room. Centeno said he could only deduce what horrible things the mayor had planned for Eileen. Meanwhile, the mayor's squad started beating up Allan. He was then thrown out of the house, and Kawit kicked Allan's abdominal area and hit him with the butt of an Armalite gun. Allan folded over and fell onto a cement box. Allan was presumed dead by some in the group, but Kawit said that Allan's death would come later, seemingly sure that Allan was still alive at that moment, which he was, but Allan was already very injured at that point. Centeno then testified that whilst waiting for further orders, he joined two of the mayor's aides in another part of the property. They were watching TV. One of them, Raul Alorico, informed Centeno that the mayor had eagerly awaited their arrival, almost worrying that they would not arrive. Centeno was not quite sure what to do with that information and just sat still with the aides until around 1 a.m. Around this time, Centeno was rattled from his TV watching when he heard and then saw a crying Eileen being dragged out of the mayor's house by Luis Corcolon and George Medialdea. Centeno noted that her hair looked disheveled, her mouth was still covered by a handkerchief, and her hands were still tied. She was stripped of her white shorts. The mayor then walked out following Eileen, Luis Corcolon, and Medialdea, and said that he was thankful for the gift, that he is through with her, and she's all yours. It was clear to Centeno that what he suspected had happened to Eileen had indeed happened. The mayor had raped Eileen in his house and was now essentially releasing her to the men who were given free rein about what to do with her. The mayor then turned his attention to Allan. "What of him?" he asked. Luis Corcolon assured him that Allan will be killed, like he was just some burden they had to get rid of. I can only imagine the terror both Eileen and Allan were feeling at this point. Their lives were at the mercy of these men who did not really view them as equal human beings anymore, but as mere objects. Centeno then testified that both students were loaded into the Tamarao van and the group headed to Calauan. They were followed by the ambulance driven by Centeno. Centeno, who was unsure what more to expect from the group, noticed how the van in front of him swayed from side to side upon entering Calauan. As the night was quiet at this time, he said that he unmistakably heard a gunshot emanating from the van. The van then stopped. He saw how Allan's bloodied body was dragged out of the van and carelessly dropped onto the roadside. Kawit then aimed his Armalite gun at Allan and shot him. He then got back into the van, and the van sped away from Allan's lifeless body. Centeno, still reeling from what he saw, speedily followed the van until they stopped at a sugarcane field in Sitio Paputok by Barangay Mabacan. According to Centeno, Luis Corcolon, seemingly gleeful in a perverted way, announced to the group that it is their turn now to do what they wanted with Eileen. Centeno testified that the group started gang raping Eileen, who was pleading them to stop. When most of the group was done, Kawit told both Malabanan and Centeno that it was their turn now to do what they did to Eileen. Both Malabanan and Centeno refused. Centeno would later explain that he could not stomach what the men had done to Eileen. He further described that Eileen did not stop crying, pleading her captors to stop their assault on her and to release her instead. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Kawit was the last to have his way with Eileen, who afterwards looked almost lifeless. Eileen then managed to kneel on the seat of the van and pleaded one more time for her life. Luis Corcolon saw it fit to silence her yet again by stuffing her mouth with an object Centeno did not clearly see. Centeno then remembered how things happened so quickly from that point on. The object that Luis stuffed into Eileen's mouth was the tip of a baby Armalite gun. Luis pulled the trigger and Eileen died on the spot. The life of a bright, smart, and charming woman extinguished just like that after these monsters had their way with her. A shocked Centeno was then ordered to dispose of her body. Centeno did what he was ordered, as he did not have much of a choice, really. Any attempt to show a deviation from the group's plan and, well, frenzy could potentially put him in danger. So, he made sure to place Eileen's lifeless body on the floor of the van, closed the van's door, and left with the rest of the group in the ambulance. Centeno would later recount that the men who gang raped Eileen were in a sickening, victorious mood, recounting how they violated Eileen. Both Centeno and Malabanan were horrified, but tried not to show it. Centeno continued to drive and drop off each of the men at their respective homes. The next day, as Centeno would testify, the group gathered again. Medialdea and Centeno fetched Malabanan, Luis, and Zuilo Ama in the ambulance, and all of them headed to Barangay Imok. The plan was to pretend as if they were on police business. This was easy, as Medialdea was indeed a police officer, and the rest of the group were members of the mayor's staff who worked closely with the police. The group drove back to the site where they had dumped Allan's body. Luis Corcolon, Medialdea, and Malabanan got off the ambulance. Luis then ordered Centeno to drive back to Calauan, specifically to the municipal hall. Luis's relative, Rogelio, was already waiting there. He and Zuilo Ama put on quite a show when Rogelio so obviously, and maybe theatrically, informed Ama that a body was found inside a Tamaraw van. Ama then played his part in this little charade and radioed the Philippine National Police Chief of Calauan, Major Canyo. He happened to be with Mayor Sanchez at that very moment after the mayor summoned him. The major then radioed another police officer, Melesio Nunez, and urged him to investigate the matter ASAP. Meanwhile, Centeno was ordered to fetch the men he dropped off at Imok and drive them to Mabacan, where Eileen's body was still lying lifeless on the floor of the Tamaraw van. I think you will now understand why I could not tell you right away the circumstances in which Eileen and Allan's bodies were found. They were, in essence, fake found by the very same men, the very same monsters who tortured and killed them. These men had planned this. They orchestrated this not only to pretend as if they didn't know anything about Eileen and Allan, but maybe also to cover their tracks. It was all a plot to throw off any other police investigators who were already on their way to the two crime scenes. When Centeno was first asked to give his testimony to confess to anything really in relation to Eileen and Allan, he was asked as well to describe Eileen's body in the van. He was hesitant. Eventually, he said that it was a pitiful sight. The gunshot wound that messed up her face could not be missed. Her shirt was still rolled up, revealing her chest. Her underwear was rolled down and her trainers were still on. Centeno said that he was surprised because he saw Medialdea cover Eileen's exposed private parts. Was this a sign of remorse? An attempt to feign shock and concern? Centeno could not be sure. Centeno was then asked what happened afterwards. Centeno testified that the group then took the van and drove it back to Los Baños. On the way there, they picked up Allan's body as well. Now I know what you're thinking. Where were those police officers such as Rizaldi Garcia who were supposed to see the crime scene and the bodies where they were found? From what I could piece together, the police first saw the bodies at the Calauan Municipal Hall. Something that is truly odd given that, for all intents and purposes, they needed to do this investigation the proper way, meaning visiting the crime scene, preserving it, and preserving any other evidence that could have been found on those bodies. To add to this rather careless mishap, Centeno added that at the municipal hall, he saw how the van was being cleaned. It is not clear whether this was done after forensic officers had seen its inside or not, but I highly doubt they did. It sounded to me like they were cleaning it pretty immediately after the van arrived in Calauan. Medialdea, together with Ama and Malabanan, then continued with their ruse of pretending to help the police investigation. They went to the site where they dumped Allan's body and asked residents whether they had seen something. The men then fake found the shell casing of the Armalite they used to kill Allan. They made sure to deliver the shell casing to the PNP chief, Major Canyo, in an attempt again to throw the police off their scent. Afterwards, Medialdea, Ama, and Malabanan, together with another police officer called Rizaldi Belen, not to be mistaken with our CIDG police investigator, Rizaldi Garcia, headed to the mayor's other property at Bay Laguna. Medialdea told the mayor that the news about the killings had started to spread and the media had gotten hold of the story. There was a growing media presence in Calauan. Additionally, the mayor was informed that other police agencies were slowly getting involved, mainly due to the growing media interest in the case, really. And the mayor was not happy about this. He blamed the men for not having the situation under control. When he finally calmed down, he reassured the men that he would make it all disappear, indicating that doing so will cost him less than the amount of a brand new car. This implies to me that the mayor was planning to pay off members of the media perhaps to quietly leave Calauan in the hope that the other police agencies would end their involvement in the case. The next day, in an odd twist of events, Medialdea handed a pair of white shorts to the local Philippine National Police Chief in Calauan, Major Canyo. Malabanan, who was present for this moment, asked Medialdea where he got the shorts and who owned them. Medialdea simply replied that they were Eileen's, and Mayor Sanchez wanted them delivered to the police. Now make sure that you make a mental note about this particular information because this will come back up later on. Now, where was Centeno in all this? Centeno testified that when this was all happening, he went to see Mayor Sanchez at his house in Calauan to talk about his worries that his name was being dragged into the investigation. Mayor Sanchez apparently told him, "Don't worry." The mayor handed him 2,000 pesos and told him to stay silent, or better yet, go into hiding. This was when Centeno disappeared from Calauan until he was tracked and found by the CIS agents. Now, you have to remember that even though Centeno was the one who was sort of the center point of the rumors going around Calauan about perhaps being a suspect in the killings of Eileen and Allan, the other men did not really do any better in keeping a low profile. Somehow they managed to raise suspicion. Centeno said that Malabanan, Medialdea, and Zuilo Ama were being interrogated at some point for allowing the Tamarao van to be cleaned. Make sure to put another pin on that for later on. Now, looking at Centeno's testimony, it somehow painted a picture of incredible arrogance, cronyism, and corruption, not only within the local police force, but also within Calauan's local executive governing body. Remember Rizaldi Garcia, the investigator from the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group? He thought so too and decided to invite Mayor Sanchez for questioning. After thorough questioning, it was decided to finally arrest Mayor Sanchez. Too many coincidences surrounded the mayor. The staff around him, the police officers who worked closely with him and his staff, were just somehow too involved in this crime in Calauan. Nevertheless, the investigators of the case needed more evidence or another witness to strengthen their case against not only the mayor but the other men. Having heard Centeno's testimony, the investigators noticed how Centeno maintained that Malabanan did not partake in the horrific gang rape of Eileen, therefore leaving some room for investigators to maybe coax him into turning into a state witness with the benefit of immunity. Although this is mere speculation on my part, the immunity bit, that is. After much convincing, Malabanan agreed to testify against the mayor and his other colleagues, essentially corroborating what Centeno had said all along. But what of the mayor's defense? During the trial, lawyers had established what they thought was a huge reason for reasonable doubt, and therefore grounds for immediate acquittal. It was not Mayor Sanchez who raped Eileen and had both Eileen and Allan killed. It was Eileen's rumored ex-boyfriend, Kid Alquesa. Now I know what you're thinking. Who is Kid Alquesa? And we will get there. But for now, I would like to pause this story and invite you to listen to part 2, which I will publish in 3 days. You will then learn more about the mayor's story and the story of the other men who were implicated in these horrific crimes. In part 2, we will briefly talk about the trial and the Supreme Court's decision, and hopefully end with some updates about the case since the Supreme Court's decision in 1999. Again, thank you so much for listening to this first part of the Sarmenta and Gomez story. I know it is quite infuriating to not have everything in one episode, but this first episode has just gone far too long, and I felt like it's better to split it so you get a bit of a break and you can resume listening to this particular story in 3 days' time. Just remember that after part 2 of the Sarmenta and Gomez story, normal publishing dates will then resume, meaning that I will be publishing stories every 2 weeks as per usual. Before I go, just make sure to check out all our socials and follow us there. We are on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok even at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook. Just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Please also rate us on Apple Podcasts. It really helps boost this little podcast of mine. Just leave a 5-star rating and a few nice words. I would be very, very grateful. Again, thank you very much for listening. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.